Hi, and welcome back to the Cutting Edge podcast. My name is Nabeela Vally, and today we're chatting about access to market. We're joined by Trevor Naidoo, the founder and director of ProcureSense. And let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So, Trevor, we're obviously here to chat about access to market, but before we get into it, I want to know a little bit about you. Obviously, you were born and then you're here on the chair. What's the story in between?
Yeah, so born and bred in Durban, grew up in a township, studied engineering, and then one of the biggest things that one of my lecturers said to me was, with engineering, you could effectively work in any industry. And so I sought out to do that. So during my corporate career, I've worked in multiple industries, looked at supply chain work and optimization, and that led me to procurement. And I worked in procurement for a period of time. And thereafter, I went into social impact investing, and then I started ProcureSense.
Great. And so you obviously, your business, ProcureSense, is centered around procurement, right? Which is an element of access to market. But before we get into that, I just want to touch around this point around access to market. We know that the three main challenges any SME faces is access to skills, which is customized and relevant for their business, access to finance, which is understanding and not competing with conventional funding, and then access to market or access to revenue. But can you shed some light on why is access to market important and what is it actually?
Yeah, sure. So why is access to market important? I think it's a term that's been used. I think let's perhaps move beyond compliance. So why is access to market important for the country? And when you look at it, access to market is important for the country because when you look at it from an economic stimulation point of view. So we are well aware that South Africa has an unemployment problem. Yeah. Research also shows that across any economy in the world, small businesses are the largest job creators. So if we want to solve that problem and we want to create jobs, we need to create sustainable small businesses that are not just surviving, but also growing. Mm-hmm. To your point earlier, three of the major barriers around this is access to market, access to finance, and then upskilling of entrepreneurs. I would argue that access to market is the most important. And the reason is, if you even look around the world, you have Silicon Valley businesses that are funded, they're capacitated, and yet 2 or 3 years later, they tank, they're not in existence. And it's because they haven't solved this thing called access to market. Mm-hmm. So in the context of South Africa, access to market becomes extremely important from a job creation point of view, right? So if we understand why is access to market important, it's important. One of the reasons is stimulating the economy, creating innovation within our economy. And the third reason is to also create jobs. So that's why access to market is important. So what is actually access to market? Because it's a term that's been used and I think it's been used loosely. Yeah. In the context of our conversation, access to market is really providing or enabling small businesses to participate within the economy. Yeah. And there's various ways in which we can do that, right? So participating mean how does a small business get contracts? How do they get opportunities that they can convert into contracts? How do they actually impact their top line, meaning their revenue? Yeah. So access to market boils down to how do we create more opportunities for small businesses to increase their top line, either via contracts or selling more products or services.
Which is also around how do we help SMEs become more sustainable in the long run, because access to market is not only one contract, one opportunity, it's actually long-term diversified revenue for these SMEs.
Yeah. 100%. Right. So once you solve the initial problem of access to market as a small business, the next risk you sit with is concentration risk. Yeah. So a lot of small businesses will place all of their emphasis on one client and they push all of their resources, etc. And the risk that they face is that if they do not diversify, at the end of that contract, they end up in the same situation that they did before they started with that. So diversification in access to market is also important. Mm-hmm. It's not just important for the small business, but it's important for the clients that the business is dealing with, because it also de-risks them as well. 100%. So if they're dealing with a very strategic piece of work and a their client is their majority client. If that business tanks, and we've seen it with COVID, it creates supply chain risk for the client that they're working with.
Yeah.
So it's important on both sides.
So the lens of access to market is important on both sides. I hear that, but maybe let's talk around where is access to market actually created? Because there's a number of avenues where you can say that access to market is created. But for the context of this conversation, and specifically based on what you do, where is access to market created for SMEs?
Cool. So if we've established that access to market is pivotal from a stimulation of our economy, from innovating within our economy and to create jobs, we then need to find out like where is the access to market. There's multiple research that shows that in South Africa, and this ratio is similar across the world, that corporate South Africa spends 3 times more than the government, right? So if we want to enable access to market, the way is actually in corporate South Africa, not government. So that's the way.
And it's created through various policies, legislations, but ideally it's the buying of goods and services from the corporate in the market, right?
100%.
And so if we talk about what the current landscape is, in terms of access to market, but also procurement in corporate South Africa.
Yeah.
Well, can you shed some light on that?
Sure. So from our research, what we found is that corporate South Africa, in general, less than 10% of their purchasing of goods or services is with small businesses in South Africa. And so therein lies, you can see where the problem lies, right? So if we understand job creation sits with small businesses.
And corporates are spending 3 times more than government, but yet only 10% of their spend is with SMEs.
Right, so how do we stimulate the economy? We need to move from 10% much higher. But there's some challenges, right? So we've had legislation that's been supporting this for a number of years. So then the question is, okay, if we know that this is a critical area for economic growth, for stimulation, innovation, job creation, why is it still sitting at 10%?
Yeah.
And to understand that, I'll give you a sort of a metaphor, right? Conventional procurement, so traditional conventional procurement best practice, stipulates that you need to consolidate and rationalize your supplier base, number one, and rationalize your spend. So in layman's terms, it says, spend with less suppliers, but spend more with less suppliers.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is their systems, processes, structures are geared towards dealing generally big business deals with big business.
Yeah.
So how does that play out, right? If you take an example of stationery, they would rationalize the spend for their entire function, and then they would deal with one big stationery supplier.
Sure.
Okay, so that's procurement best practice from a conventional perspective. And you must also remember the function of procurement traditionally is to mitigate the risk of an organization and to ensure that proper governance is put into place, especially for publicly listed companies, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's procurement best practice. What do we need in our economy, right? So from an economic point of view, we actually need our economy to be stimulated.
Yeah.
And we know that job creation happens to small businesses. So we have legislation that is supporting the unbundling of spend, right? So localize your spend. Don't spend with one big brother. Rather find suppliers that are closer to your area of operation and spend with them. And so on the face of it, right, what our legislation and our economy is asking for almost seems like it's in complete contradiction and opposition to what procurement best practice is. So it's seen as oil and water. The two don't mix, right? So that's from a conventional procurement perspective, which most corporates are actually set up to do because their primary function is risk mitigation and ensuring governance is taken place. And so what ends up happening is even for organizations that are pro small businesses, their structure within the organization
and their policy
does not enable them to actually go about doing it. And so what ends up happening, you have suppliers that are introduced, small businesses, disruptive, innovative businesses. But when you look at the procurement process, one of the first gates of procurement is to understand, is their compliance met? And that is in the form of, do you have your ISO 9001? Do you have specific documents, etc.? And a lot of small businesses don't have that. So they don't even get to pricing, right?
Oh, so they fall off at the first gate.
Right? If they actually are allowed within the first gate, right? So we can talk about why most small businesses struggle to even get into procurement opportunities within a corporate, but we can leave that for later.
Yeah. So if we dig deeper on that point, we're saying that most businesses or most small businesses are not making it through the first or second gate, if anything. But there is a need for us to look at why, firstly, and secondly, is there anything that corporates are doing to help these SMEs move through these gates? Now, the starting point of this is preferential procurement, and I want to touch a little bit on preferential procurement and what it is, what it entails, but also how does it tie into enterprise and supply development in actually helping overcome the challenge that you've pointed out now. So,
Sure.
in your opinion, what is preferential procurement and how does it help?
Sure. So I think to answer that question, I think let's borrow from Stephen Covey, where he says, let's begin with the end in mind.
Yeah.
So what is the end in mind for ESD, right? So the end in mind is for a supplier or a group of suppliers to be inculcated into your supply chain and getting more contracts and doing more business, okay? And the support structures from a legislation to do that is enterprise development and supply development.
Right.
So in an ideal scenario, you should be thinking about, or an organization should be thinking about, what are the areas within my value chain or supply chain that needs transformation and disruption and innovation?
Yeah.
And understanding that and then leveraging of enterprise development and supply development initiatives to build and capacitate suppliers for their future supply chain.
Sure.
So that's how it should ideally work. What happens, not in all instances, is that these things are looked at in silos. So you'll have an organization or someone within an organization that looks at enterprise development, and then someone that looks at supply development, and then someone else who's in charge of preferential procurement. And these within these functions, they work within silos, but the actual intent is for it to work in an integrated, cohesive manner to create value, not just for the SMEs, not just for our economy, but if you do it in the right way, the corporate actually gets benefit beyond compliance.
Sure. And so if we had to stay on this point a little bit, and we see a lot of the times that these SMEs who fall through actually going on to an ED program, an SD program, but being able to then enjoy in access to market or contract opportunities, right? What does that, from a corporate perspective, what does that look like? If you can, maybe elaborate through an example on how these elements align and come together.
Okay, sure. So I think to help answer that question, I'll paint the picture of what has happened in the past when it comes to ED, SD, and preferential procurement. Is from a procurement perspective, remember, their objective is to mitigate risk and ensure governance takes place. So the opportunities that they would normally find for ED and SD initiatives historically was what I call pots and pans and beads and bangles opportunities, right? So opportunities that are not strategic or tactical in nature for the organization's supply chain. And so what ends up happening is that programs are being run for stationary service providers and a supplier that provides them with paper. Now, when we look at it, so you'll get compliance for sure, right? But you're not getting a return on investment from a corporate perspective. And you're not getting innovation because these are highly commoditized pieces of spend. So that's what's traditionally happened. Why has it happened, right? There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, procurement functions are set up to do conventional procurement, right? So structurally, they're not set up to enable disruptive businesses to come into their organization. Even though they may say they do, it's very difficult because their processes and policies and strategies not geared up for that. So that's the first problem, right, that needs to be addressed. The second thing is that even if you set up your operating model to move from a transactional procurement perspective or
kind of operational and tactical, because that's how they operate.
Right.
Now,
so that's generally how it works. Right. So to move from operational and tactical, you need to redesign your operating model to be more strategic and to think value chain perspective. Right. It's not easy, but it can be done. That's the first problem that needs to be solved. Even when you do that, though, if you don't have information to support you, right, it's like you're effectively trying to throw darts in the dark. And so data becomes essential in how you actually design your operating model. And so that leads me to the second problem that corporates generally face is they have ERP systems, they have data, but they do not have information.
Okay.
Right? And so at best with their ERP systems, what they can answer is what happened, and at best they can say, why did it happen?
Yeah.
For you to move from a tactical procurement perspective, you need to be asking the question or answering the question of how can we make this happen?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a future, it moves beyond
Forward-looking.
predictive.
Yeah.
It moves beyond predictive. It's forward looking. It's like, how can we use the information that we have to determine and map a path for us to make certain things happen? And because procurement functions and supply chain functions don't have the ability to do that, it becomes very difficult. And that's why we have traditionally seen pots and pans and beads and bangles kind of initiatives taking place.
Yeah.
And so that's the second thing, because when you have the ability to look forward and say, how do we make this happen? You can start answering questions like, this is how we're going to localize spend.
Yeah.
That is sitting with a company in Europe.
And these are in key commodity areas,
yes,
right?
it's in key. It allows you to move from commoditized spend areas to more tactical and strategic things.
Yeah.
And when you couple that, and so the question is, why do they not do that, right?
Yeah.
You have to have a view beyond your value chain.
Yeah.
So you have to have a view beyond your corporate supply chain, and you have to complement what you have in terms of information with market information. And that requires a different type of expertise, and it requires a lot of data cleaning and big data analytics for you to do that, because then you're looking across your value, your value chain.
Sure. And I think that actually then bridges the gap more intelligently between what you're trying to do in enterprise and supply development, and it brings to life preferential procurement, ED and SD in a more sustainable manner. Right.
100%, yeah.
What I want to get a sense of though is where where corporates have done it well.
Yeah.
And obviously you've been involved in those. Can you give us some form of examples where it's been done well and what it's resulted in?
Sure. So by applying some of these principles that I'm speaking about, we've helped some of our corporate partners to effect massive change.
Yeah.
So in the last 5 years, we've helped corporates to shift 5 billion rand of corporate South African procurement spend to small and local businesses across South Africa.
These are Black-owned SMEs getting access to market opportunities.
100%. Black-owned, Black women-owned SMEs.
Yeah.
And how we did it was helping our corporate partners restructure their operating model from a transactional procurement perspective to a value chain perspective.
Okay.
That was the first thing. The second thing was that we then went and did deep big data analytics to understand where the opportunities beyond beads and bangles.
Yeah.
And how can we disrupt that vertical within their value chain?
Yeah.
Right. So it requires an organization to almost say to themselves, we want to disrupt ourselves. And one of the areas in which we want to disrupt ourselves is through our value chain.
So it's almost a change in mindset.
It
right?
is required.
Yeah.
So part of what is required, I'm talking about operating model, we're talking about data analytics, a massive portion of it. All of those things are well and good. If there isn't a mindset change within the organization, these things will fall flat. So another key element is that we're moving beyond compliance, right? So you cannot do this by having a compliance lens. You have to do this from having a value lens. And so, yes, we shift 5 billion rand, okay, across South Africa with our corporate partners. But just as importantly, in doing that, we've helped corporate South Africa to save 1 billion rand off their procurement spend.
This is actual saving,
Actual
right?
savings over the 5-year period.
Okay.
Right, so that's moving beyond compliance. It's value perspective.
And it actually creates dual value. So you're saying corporates, okay, we're shifting spend, but at the same time, we're saving money, right? And in a post-COVID world, that becomes very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it becomes important for so many reasons, right? Because corporates now need to reorientate how they think about their value chains.
Yeah.
And its localization is becoming important.
Sure.
So they almost need disruptive, innovative solutions within different verticals of their supply chain. You traditionally do not find that with big businesses because they set in their ways.
Yeah.
And big businesses as in being big suppliers to them.
Yeah.
Where the disruption and the innovation takes place is with the smaller suppliers that have almost had to say, okay, these are all of the barriers within this sector.
Yeah.
I don't have the money, I don't have the resources, I don't have the power to overcome these barriers. How do I circumvent them?
Sure.
And they are generally using innovative methods, technologies to actually get that. And in doing that, they're providing intrinsic value to corporates.
The corporate. And they're agile enough to do it quickly.
Yes.
So the common, I'm going to call it a misconception because it sounds like it is that for corporate, doing business with small to medium entrepreneurs or enterprises often says that, you're going to compromise on quality, you're not going to get your goods on time, and then often they're way overpriced. So I'm hearing that that's quite the opposite.
Yeah, it's totally untrue,
Yeah.
right? Do you get those suppliers in the market? Yes, you do, right? But you find more innovative and disruptive suppliers. And it's just, think about it from a principles point of view.
Yeah.
Why do small businesses even exist across the world? They have to be agile, they have to be innovative and disruptive in order for them to survive. And that's the value that they bring to corporates.
Yeah. And as a corporate, you can't yourself be agile, but you can get that through the SMEs that you work with. So but it's important for us to understand, you've made a point around compliance, and it's no longer about compliance, but compliance has been an important key enabler to getting this right, okay? And so when it comes to the compliance element around it, you're seeing that through having this new mindset change and having a different view, you're creating compliance or efficiencies in your compliance, but then you're creating financial efficiency through cash flow and savings, and then you're creating impact and inclusion through the initiatives or the access to market that you're granting these SMEs. Because that's the crux of whether it's procurement or preferential procurement, it's creating access to market opportunities, right?
100%, yeah.
Yeah. And so if we had to, have a forward-looking lens, like you said, what is it? What can we do to improve access to market as corporate clients? What do we need to take into consideration?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to stop looking at things from a silo perspective.
Yeah.
And to understand that the new norm is to have an integrated view. And I know I've been in corporate, we've all worked in corporates, we speak about these terms, but you still work within silos. The next layer of value within a corporate, leave the SMEs and inclusion and access to market. The next layer for any corporate of value is integration within their business alone. And so you need to have a value lens when you're looking at that and understand that these pieces all work together. And when you can get them to work together in unison, that's when you can create the next level of value. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that also understanding corporates have certain structures, and you need to bring in the right partners who understand and have that same mindset, but more importantly have methods, technologies that can enable that to happen. So I would say those are the first thing. Mindset is super important on how you go about looking at this. And I would say, yes, compliance is important. It's brought all of these things to fruition that we speak about. But when you look at it from a value perspective, let's look beyond BEE, right? So that's South African legislation. Worldwide, there's a growing trend towards ESG, environmental, social, and governance. I would almost argue that BEE is a subset of that.
Yeah.
And what the market is showing, and I'm sure you can provide more light to this, is that companies that have inculcated ESG within their organization and also filtered across their value chain become more valuable.
Absolutely.
And there's research around that.
Yeah, and those companies that do ESG well and are listed and traded publicly actually have higher share values because they're perceived to want to do better and want to create sustainability in the environments in which they operate. So that's correct in saying at the same time, BE is a portion of ESG. It's enabling ESG in certain industries as well.
Yeah. So to sort of like summarize that, I think historically, the premise for big businesses was we need to do good business, right? And a subset of that was we've got this thing called compliance in all forms and within the business that we have to do. It's necessary. So it's almost like a grudge purchase. But the perspective that now is changing is not do good business, do business for good.
Yeah.
And if you do business for good, it completely changes. It's not compliance anymore.
Yeah.
Right? It's actually value adding.
Yeah.
And I would say the biggest thing that needs to happen is the mindset shift within organizations.
Sure.
and to look at risk differently. Risk provides you an opportunity to get some of your business for good initiatives done through localization.
Yeah.
So it's protecting your business, but it's also increasing the value and helping you with ESG targets.
And it's not as if you're not deriving any value from it, because it's been proven that companies who have made this, like you say, the shift to value creation and looking at procurement and joining the dots between preferential procurement, enterprise and supply development, all the elements of compliance. When they've made that shift, they've actually realized bigger value other than just having, the right level to interact with, or having the right BEE level.
100%. Like, and I know we're talking about compliance, but I'll always go back. It needs to make sense in a commercial perspective and ESG BE perspective. And we always say in our organization, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey.
Yeah.
So there are companies that are on this trend that are actually making, that have a value chain perspective, that are no longer just cost saving, right?
Yeah.
They're actually generating revenue. So when you combine ESG with BEE and you have a value chain perspective, you're ahead of the game from a carbon footprint perspective. There's companies that have gone ahead, done all of these things, and their carbon footprint is close to zero or zero, which enables them to sell their credits and make money out of it.
Yeah.
So these trends are taking place, but you cannot have a conventional procurement view around it. And you need to have a forward-looking procurement, supply chain, value chain perspective, and bring compliance into all of those things.
Yeah.
When you do that, you can create intrinsic value for yourself as an organization, but also help stimulate the economy.
Yeah, and I think, we've gone in a whirlwind way around access to market, and access to market for SMEs, but actually we're saying it starts with the corporate South Africa, or the biggest buyer or procurer within our country, which is corporate South Africa. And from what I'm hearing you say is that essentially the main points to getting creating access to market from a corporate perspective is to firstly have a shared value perception about when it comes to procurement. And then helping or using legislation like preferential procurement in ED and SD to enable that, instead of having compliance. But if we had to take the other view, and I'm sure you're sitting in a position that you're able to look at both sides, but if we had to take the other view, what in your opinion are some of the barriers that SMEs within South Africa face when it comes to access to market?
Okay, so I think the first and obvious one that I mentioned is all of the compliance, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about business compliance, but then also within your field, the technical compliance requirements that are there.
Yeah.
That's your ticket. That's your most basic ticket to the game. And what we find is a lot of small businesses don't have that. And why it's important is they need to recognize that from a procurement process, it's one of the first gates that we will put in any procurement process is, do you have compliance in place? And that would be the first barrier. So barrier number one. Barrier number two is the rest of the barriers I'm going to speak about are internal, that the SMEs, I would say, place on themselves or are not aware of it. And the second one is pricing.
Yeah.
So what we find and see is that SMEs are either outpricing themselves, either being like, 40, 50, 60, 70%, sometimes 300% higher.
And you've seen this.
I've seen it, yeah. We've seen, we can talk about this for days. We've seen this happen so many times, right? So they do that. The inverse also happens, where SMEs underprice themselves, right? And if I can put on my procurement hat for a moment, generally, when we make a decision, we don't choose the highest, but we also don't choose the cheapest always.
Yeah.
So it's not only about price. We'll go for a medium in most cases because of how the evaluation criteria works within procurement. So the first thing I would say is pricing. SMEs just don't understand pricing and how to price themselves relative to the market.
And because they're competing with other big suppliers, big businesses, they don't understand that the level of competitive pricing that they need to put forward. So, like you're saying, if it's too high, they're getting kicked out of the game. But if it's too low, there's a perception of, oh, I'm going to compromise on quality if I go too low. But at the same time, your fellow bidders are big corporates who understand this game.
Yeah, and I can almost tell you, for SMEs that are watching this, they'll be a group of SMEs that say, but you don't understand, the industry I work within is volume based.
Yeah.
Right? And so I can never compete with them on pricing. They will always be cheaper. 100%, that is true in certain sectors. Then I would say then the next layer is you need to understand pricing first. And then the next layer is how do you deliver value beyond the price point?
Sure.
And that's how you can start competing. Because in a procurement process, we don't only look at price.
Yeah.
We look at pricing, functional, there's points awarded for functional specification, your understanding of the proposal and what's required. There's weighting as well for technical criteria. So you may have a new technology that's in place that will outstrip a conventional big player in the market. So that's another area of value. BEE and your BE criteria is also another value. And we almost always, any good procurement practice will have points allocated for value adds.
Okay.
Right? That go beyond the scope of the work.
Yeah.
And those, so firstly, you have to understand how pricing works. Okay. So let's assume the SME understands. And then they might be dealing in a sector where you're dealing with, monopolistic type of businesses where you can never compete with them on pricing. There's other areas from an evaluation perspective that you can compete on. And that would be my suggestion, because then you move beyond price and you move to value. And that's the first thing that I think entrepreneurs don't pay enough attention to.
And are causing intrinsic barriers to them accessing market.
They're causing barriers to themselves.
Right?
The second thing I would say is a realization that of the market that we're dealing with. And I'm going to speak about South Africa specifically. If you're working with corporates or want to work with corporates, or your business offering is best suited towards corporates, in South Africa, corporates are big ships and they take a long time to turn. So what that means for your business is that their sales cycles are exceptionally long.
Sure.
And yes, you can put initiatives in place to try and reduce the sales cycle.
Yeah.
But in general, corporate South Africa's sales cycle is long. And so what we see end up happening is there's SMEs that will place all of their resources and focus on one corporate and spend 6 to 12 months trying to get that corporate over the line. The problem is that what if the corporate says no?
Yeah, but also when they've landed the corporate, because you know the sales cycle, you know what it's taken you to get that client, you focus again all your resources, all your effort into servicing this one client, which often takes away time for you to get other clients, to run your sales process and sales cycle. So it comes back to your point around diversification is so important.
Yeah. So in sales, firstly, they don't have an actual sales strategy or view of how they're going to approach sales.
Yeah.
And so they just run after the biggest fish that they can see for that point in time. And you have to diversify. So have a lot of lines in the water and find a way to streamline your process where you're constantly checking up on each of these lines while working with an existing client.
But to carry on the fishing analogy, you have to cast very strategically.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's strategic sales. It's not okay, we got this product, we're just gonna sell it. We need to be very strategic about who we sell it to, how we sell it to them.
Yes, and the reason for that is entrepreneurs or small businesses will always have a capacity constraint.
Yeah.
And so you need to be very strategic in where you go about doing this. Not every corporate is for you. And so that means that you have to put a lot of thought into who's my ideal client on both sides, not just for you, but like where's my product or service best suited? Where's the biggest pain? Oh, it sits in this corporate here. And this is what the type of avatar looks like from a corporate or ideal client perspective. And that takes time. You have to strategize, think about these things, and then have a view of, okay, we're only focusing on that. What it also requires, this is another constraint, is that you probably need to, as an entrepreneur, we're wired to say yes, right? But you almost need to have the discipline to say no more often than you say yes.
Yeah.
Because you may take on a client that drains you of all of your resources, that puts you behind 3 to 4 years in your business journey.
Yeah.
So a discipline of saying no more often than saying yes is critical in doing that. And I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs are like, yes, we'll do it. We can do anything, but it's going to hurt you in the long run.
But then it speaks to pricing, right?
Yeah.
What helps you make that decision is also understanding the margins that you're probably going to make on this client, and if it's worthwhile investing more time, more energy, that's going to take away from other things, but actually going to result in a healthier margin. Most of the times, clients who absorb most of your resources and your time will eat into the margin that you have left over as cash flow at the end of the month or end of the year, right?
Yeah, with corporates, there's always scope creep,
Yeah.
right? And so you have to build that in. But there's often times where we've made strategic decisions because of the importance of the client to reinvest, right?
Okay.
So we take the profits out of that specific project or client, and we reinvest it back into the client. And that's another point, is I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't take consideration of feeding money back into the business.
Yeah.
You look at Amazon, right? For 10 years, all they did was took any profit and they put it back. So their balance sheet didn't look great because they were never making money, but they were investing into the future. I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't think about, how do I take profits from my business and reinvest it into my client base, reinvest it into technology, so that I can continue to be quicker, better, faster in what I'm doing and have that edge.
So I know there's SMEs watching out there that's going to say, yeah, I hear all of that, Trevor, and I do all of that. But yet it's still, doing business in corporate South Africa is still about who you know. And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I would say that there is truth in what they're saying.
Yeah.
South Africa and Africa. So if you want to play in South Africa and the African market, it's very relational.
Yeah.
Whereas in other countries, it's the smartest person, the person with the greatest tech or innovation often gets to open the door.
Yeah.
So yes, South Africa and Africa in general is a relational type of culture. And so that is a reality. And you need to understand that, and also understand that the sales cycle takes a long time.
Yeah.
And so that what that means then is those are things that are not going to change. So if you're an entrepreneur and you want to play the short game, then you're in the wrong business.
Yeah.
You need to play the long game and think about, how do I, if I know that these constraints exist within the market, how do I start building and preparing now?
Yeah.
And that speaks to how you approach sales and your strategy around it. What we've done in the past is we've identified that businesses like doing business with other big established businesses. And we've gone and partnered with other big established businesses because they're already in the corporate supply chain.
Yeah.
And what we've identified is business A, which is a big business, works within this vertical, okay? And they offer value to their corporate supply base in this manner. We're actually, our value offering is a congruency to theirs. So they offer value in what they do, we offer our value in what we do. If we were to combine it, we're offering intrinsic value to the client now. They can't do what we do, we can't do what they do.
Yeah.
We're not encroaching on each other's space. And we spent a lot of time cultivating partnerships with businesses that play in the space that we play in, that already have a foot into other corporates.
Yeah.
So then it's someone that is trusted by the corporate that is introducing you into them. It shortens your cycle time, and it also allows you to have many lines in the water at the same time. So the truth is, yes, it is like that. It is a reality within South African business. How do you now strategize around it to actually get value? And one of the ways is to partnership, collaborating with other small businesses as well.
Yeah.
But our guiding principle around that is there has to be congruency.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and partner with a business that does exactly what we do, because there will be problems.
100%.
How do you find businesses that support what you do, and when you add these two things or three things together, it creates a value solution beyond what any other organization individually could do.
And so what I'm hearing is there's an importance on understanding your pricing, there's importance to diversify your revenue, there's an importance on collaboration with other organizations that could help you get into the door faster or quicker. But there's also, we've just touched a lot on legislation earlier, and we've spoken about different kinds of legislation and what have you. Is there a way outside of the relational aspect, outside of a pure RFP, that SMEs could look into when trying to get access to market?
Yeah, it should be pretty obvious, right? If you're a small business, how do you leverage legislation, right? So corporates are incentivized to conduct ESG initiatives.
Yeah.
a way of doing that without any partnership is to go into an ESD program. Why? Because the partners that the corporate's working with on ESD programs has a trusted relationship with them. Their job is to build the capacity for these SMMEs. And they're building capacity
to get them through those gates that we spoke
them through. So it's designed, the programs are designed to help them move through all of those stage gates that work within procurement, right? So you're learning as an entrepreneur, you're getting it for free in most cases. All you have to do is do investment of time, but to build up your capability and understanding of the organization. And then you effectively, if they're going to be looking, if a corporate's looking for new businesses, the first place they're going to go to is in the ESD initiatives that they've invested in, the businesses that they have invested in. So it's an investment that will help you from a capability, potentially even give you access to funding, but then it brings you closer to a corporate that you have targeted, and you can leverage off the trusted partner, who is whoever the ESD partner is for the corporate, to actually build rapport with the corporate while you're learning.
But it also speaks to, earlier you made the point around value, the value add. When you're adjudicating and when you're evaluating these SME, the potential supplier, you're looking at value adds and what have you. But we're saying that actually what you could do is say that you're adding value on different levels, right? You're adding value from firstly, you're saying to the corporate that this is my pricing, I'm good on pricing, but there's other elements where you're adding value. So through legislation, you could be, one of them is that I'm on an enterprise and supply development program and I'm adding value for you there. But there probably are other value adds that you could punt using legislation.
Yeah, so you could use ESG as an example. You might have a business that helps with water recycling as an example.
Yeah.
You need to incorporate that into your value proposition.
But you have to understand what their ESG goals are. So it takes deeper research.
So it takes deeper research. One of the benefits of being in an ESD program is that you're almost getting indirect insight into what is the culture of this organization, what is important for them, what are their pain points.
Yeah.
And you could then structure or use legislation to enable you to create more value within your organization.
So there's definitely that element around ED, SD, ESG, but there's also value around preferential procurement, right?
Yeah,
that you could put forward.
100%. So I think the first premise, remember we spoke about pricing, is you got to be competitive pricing wise, technical, functional, and then, but as a cherry on the top, as another value add, most SMEs don't understand how preferential procurement works. So in a nutshell, it is a scorecard that sits within the BE legislation that rewards corporates for doing business with small businesses and small black businesses. Right? So as an example, if you're a white-owned business that is under 10 million, okay, from a preferential procurement perspective, you're adding value to them on two buckets within the scorecard, on EME as well as their alt spend. So to give you a practical example of that, let's take a majority black-owned business that is under 10 million. For every 1 rand that a corporate spends with them, the corporate gets 1.35 rands in preferential procurement, right? First level. But because they're an EME under 10 million and they're black-owned, and they hit the alt spend bucket. I'm getting too technical now, right? But effectively, the scorecards, preferential procurement scorecard has got 5 buckets. But with you being of that caliber, you're black owned and you're under 10 million. You're effectively saying to them, on a preferential procurement scorecard perspective, every rand you spend on me, you're getting 1.35 rand plus 1.35 rand plus 1.35
depending on the buckets that you're hitting.
Depending on the buckets that you're hitting. So you're adding immense value from a compliance perspective, and that should be incorporated in your proposal.
And so, I mean, many SMEs don't know that or don't understand it, but also it's about how you articulate it. But it's important that we stress that is just, like you said, a cherry on the top. You're first doing everything you can and everything that's possible to align to the criteria in the other buckets, which is the pricing and what have you. And then this here is an added value that you're showing the people adjudicating the bid. So, I mean, Trev, you've been on this journey of entrepreneurship yourself. So any As we close and as we wrap, any parting shots for the entrepreneurs that are watching?
If you're not in entrepreneurship, don't do it. It's a tough road. It's very difficult. I would say the one thing that's kept me going is to have a purpose beyond the business, beyond myself, etc. So what I would guard against, if you're an entrepreneur and you're in it for money, it's not sustainable. It becomes very difficult. You may make a lot of money, but it's not sustainable. And so what's helped me is to have a mission and a purpose for myself, for our business, that goes beyond anyone in our organization. And that's what excites me. So it's got to be something that you're passionate about, I found, for me, and something that is going to leave a mark beyond your business and looking towards how you're helping other people. That's been my North Star. And from the successful entrepreneurs that I've engaged with, I found that to be very similar. You have to have something that is beyond yourself, have a North Star that is looking to create a legacy outside of your business. And that will hold you in good stead for all of the storms to come.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us at home or wherever you're watching from. Remember to join the conversation in the comments below. Follow our podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, where we will be releasing a new episode every 2 weeks. Or subscribe to the Edge Growth YouTube channel to catch the conversation.